And so we return and begin again. Welcome to part 2 of the Invisible Podcast. I'm Bobsy. You hopefully know the score by now. Invisible Podcast issue 2, issuesode 2, aren't they all? We're going issue by issue, page by page, panel by panel, but most importantly, theory by theory through Grant Morrison's Invisibles. The Invisibles published by DC Comics and Vertigo. We're going through issue 2. This is it. Beautiful condition, like perfectly intact, and then you start doing a podcast about it. Oh no, the cover comes off. The rule is, the lesson here, I guess, is don't do podcasts about comics. Podcasting destroys comics. I mean, what can you say? This has done the past 25 years pretty well. This one, of course, was published in October 1994 is the cover date, which means it probably came out around October 2004. Realistically, so what's that? That's a little bit over 24 years ago. Quarter of a century old. It had done pretty well, and then the cover came off while I was doing the research for this episode. So what are you going to do? Never mind. Starting with the cover, of course. This is the first cover by Sean Phillips, who would go on to do pretty much all of the covers for the first book of The Invisibles, at least. What we've got here is our boy Dane McGowan, who you'll remember from issue 1, standing, looking rather sorry for himself outside Piccadilly Service Station. Piccadilly Service Station? No, that's not right. Outside Piccadilly Circus in central London. Great start. We're off to a great start. Turning the page, you get this advert here. Oh, don't look at this one. Don't look at the cowboy. An advert here for the Vertigo Rave. This is, oh, what is that backwards? Oh, that's a camera thing. We'll try and sort that out for episode 3. But I'm plowing through, as you can see. Getting the time to do this has been tricky. So we're just going to plow through. This is an advert for the Vertigo Rave. It's like the Vertigo Rave was like a kind of a sampler comic that Vertigo put out with bits and pieces from all of their upcoming issues on sale in, doesn't actually say, why would it say that? You know, available in September. Suggested for mature readers like you and me watching a podcast. It's not very nicely designed until you realise that it's kind of it's supposed to be like the titles of the issues of the series that they've got on here are meant to be like DJ crews who are at a rave. So and it doesn't look too dissimilar to rave posters of the time. The black and white printing is a horrible choice. There was a lot of clashing aesthetics at work upon the various Vertigo titles at the time. So to find a colour scheme or format that would work for all of them would be difficult. So you understand why they would try to put it, you know, they'd have to kind of grayscale everything to make it all seem consistent. But it's not a terribly exciting advert. Why am I talking more about the adverts than the comics? I don't know. They just seem to be kind of an integral part of these objects that I'm picking up, and as I'm reading them, they tell you a lot about the time and the context. And it's interesting to note that this rave concept, which has been really informative of what the Invisibles would be about and go on to be about, and kind of where it's come from as well, isn't just confined to the Invisibles. This is an aesthetic which is and a sensibility which is at work throughout Vertigo and its run at the time. They're aware that there's a rave generation reading comics that they in some measure want to speak to. So on to the comic itself. We'll do the credits when we get to the credits, so we'll just pile into page 1. Page 1. This is the Invisibles issue 2. So issue 1 last time, it was a big issue. You know, there was more pages than normal. It was a first issue, so there was a lot of setup to be had. There was a lot of like introducing, getting you into the space. And then the second issue is the one where they're like, okay, now we're going to really do the thing. This is what this comic's going to be like going forward. This is what the rest of the issues of this comic are going to be like. This is the style. This is the format. This is the tone that we're going to have. And so you'd kind of think that because this is a shorter episode and because we're kind of into the flow of it now, if you like, there'd be less to say about this. If anything, the reverse is true. I'm going to try and keep this podcast down to, about an hour, hopefully. But there's a hell of a lot to say about this. And this first page itself is incredibly, suggestive and dense. If you're trying to kind of, go fairly textually deep, which I'm hoping I can have the brain power to do. There'll be a lot in here, right? It's going to be difficult to not go through every page by page, line by line, and kind of like dig things out that way. So, okay, let's calm down a bit, Bobsy. We are in Speaker's Corner for this first episode. Speaker's Corner is a bit of Hyde Park in central London at the end of Oxford Street by Marble Arch Station, abutting the Royal Palaces in London, abutting Buckingham Palace pretty much. Famously, Speaker's Corner is a place where free speech can be had. The boundaries of permissible free speech within the UK are fairly, it's not bad. But Speaker's Corner is a place which for a long time has been where one is kind of socially permitted, and kind of after like 1877 legally permitted to say things which might be illegal elsewhere in the country. These, Britain's free speech laws aren't terrible. They're mainly about, libel and incitement are the lines that you're not really allowed to cross. You're more likely to get away with libeling somebody in Speaker's Corner. You're also quite likely to get away with inciting violence in Speaker's Corner, but mainly because nobody will really notice what you're saying. If you were to do it repetitively, and if someone was to make a complaint, you still would be arrested probably, or at least stopped. Speaker's Corner is like the home of free speech. It's a space that's been carved out of the polity, which wherein things that are verboten, which shouldn't be or cannot be said, or kind of go against the prevailing social grain, can be verbalized freely and verbalized to a crowd, right? So what you have, Speaker's Corner is kind of fun if you've never been there. It's worth a little visit. On a Sunday morning, perhaps you might find a bunch of people there. Some of them might be a bit crazy, talking, just saying stuff, talking about their theories of the world, giving a political message, giving, doing what this guy on this page is doing. In fact, telling you things which you're not supposed to hear. Now, crucially, this tradition of Speaker's Corner stems from the fact that Marble Arch used to be known as Tyburn. And the Tyburn used to be the home of the Tyburn tree, and the Tyburn tree is a gallows. Perhaps once upon a time it was actually a tree, a yew or something. I wasn't able to find any evidence of that. But before the condemned man would go up to the gallows to be hanged, he would traditionally be allowed to say anything that he wanted. That would hopefully be in order to get a confession and help his eternal soul on its way forwards. But, they would often, just grind their axes or say a joke. You'd get a good response from the crowd. These were obviously public events, these public executions. You'd get a good response from the crowd maybe if you made a joke, or although people would kind of like admit their guilt if they'd been denying it previously, or kind of like ask for forgiveness. They'd do all these things. But often the crowd would kind of warm to you more if you just kind of were a bit defiant or gave them a decent joke. So there's an element of like the carnivalesque and the humorous as kind of outside of the normal social boundaries kind of occurring here at Speaker's Corner. Speaker's Corner was in Tyburn. The hanging, the site of the public executions, was from something like, it was for like 600 years, for like from like 1190 to 17 something. I might even have it written down. You never know. So from 1196 to 1783, so for like 600 years, people were being hanged there regularly. And there's estimates, obviously the records here are very sketchy, but there are estimates that as many as 50,000 people could have been killed on this site. The air here, regardless of the speakers there, kind of channeling or voicing strange outre ideas, the air here is thick with ghosts, thick with the spirits of the dead. 50,000 people went to their rest here, passed through the Vale. It's an incredibly potent land, right? And the tradition kind of became mediated and made acceptable somehow through this kind of institution of Speaker's Corner, which no less a luminary than Eric Blair, known better today as George Orwell, would go on to describe as one of the minor miracles of the world, or one of the minor wonders of the world, because of the fact that free speech, which is never truly free and which is often, certainly within the history of England, has been an incredibly dangerous thing to do if you're a feminist or a reformer or a Quaker or a Republican or anarchist or a communist or a Catholic or any of the forbidden streams of thought within social life, where it could be said safely, and that in itself, which is, free speech is still fairly rare historically and national and internationally across the face of the globe. So Orwell thought Speaker's Corner significant enough to describe it as a minor wonder of the world. Now, before we get into this, Orwell's ghost haunts this issue of the Invisibles more probably than any other figure. We've got loads of allusions to Shakespeare and to Blake and to Aldous Huxley. We'll get onto all this in a minute. But this is an Orwell issue, and that's not insignificant. So we open on Speaker's Corner. Our boy Dane, who you'll remember from the previous episode, has just been liberated from Harmony House by a sexy kind of fetish assassin guy, King Mob, and then unceremoniously just like abandoned on the streets of London. So we pick up, presumably some days, weeks or months later. Dane is on his feet on the streets in London, and he's gone to Speaker's Corner. The first line is, "You can say what you like. You can say what you like, my friends. You can shout and call me crazy all you like, but it won't change the fact. We're all receivers. Like cheap radios, they've tuned us in, and they're making us play their music, and we don't even know it. We think our thoughts are our own, but let me tell you, they're not. Our thoughts are broadcasts. We're talking about extremely low frequency magnetic fields, blanket broadcasts by our masters in the New World Order." This first page is setting up. I'm not going to go through every line in the comic like this. We'd be here forever. This first page is setting up some of the major themes, and not just of this issue, but of the whole series, putting it into quite plain language, actually. We're talking about these ELF transmitters, programming our minds with carefully modulated waveforms. You can sneer and snigger all you like, but when you wake up at 3 a.m, anxious and agitated, and wondering where all those horrible thoughts are coming from, maybe you won't feel so smart, There are ELF generators everywhere. They're using our televisions. They're using satellites. They're using the music in bars and shopping centres. When was the last time you had a thought that wasn't put there by them? It's brilliantly written. Saying it out loud, you get a real sense of the rhythm and the kind of the declamatory nature of it. And it's also like conspiracy theory writ large, right? This is the main conspiracy that all conspiracy theory is about, is that there are invisible forces being beamed by baddies, our masters in the New World Order, and they're transmitting their mind control. Okay, so what do we think of this? Do we think that there are extremely low frequency transmitters around? Yeah, there are. They're kind of quite important to lots of types of industrial and electrical and communication infrastructure in industrialized nations. Can they program your minds with carefully modulated waveforms? Just because they can't doesn't mean that this guy isn't onto something. To broadcast a particular thought into someone's head and make them have it, that's probably not happening on a blanket scale. What my paranoia tells me is that extremely low frequency broadcasts, which kind of do tend to, which I'm probably sitting right in the middle of right now. So are you. They probably create a certain level of like imprint vulnerability. They make you a little bit more fuzzy and squishy and able to be shaped and have particular thoughts. By other forms, and these are the televisions, the satellites, and the music in the bars and the shopping centres. These are all, like, most mind control is basically about getting you to buy stuff and to behave in a certain way, and that certain way is to buy stuff. So yeah, like ELF generators, ELF transmitters aren't actually telling you what to think, but they're creating the conditions that do tell you what to think. It's important to think that mind control technology does exist. You're looking at one. I'm looking at one. And but it's it's more like an array of techniques to get and they work more efficiently if they work on a wide spectrum, right? So you can find an individual human and recondition them and make them think what you want them to think, but really that's very expensive and not necessary in like the huge majority of cases. But you can get entire populations to think what you want, to within a high percentage of accuracy, right? So you don't need to get 100% of people to think exactly the kind of thoughts you want, but you can easily get 80% of people to think broadly 80% of the thoughts that you want them to have. This is, I'm sorry to get all kind of like liberal conspiracy guy, but the stuff about Facebook around Brexit and the Trump campaigns, it's basically just like a highly developed marketing technology, and people who work in marketing and advertising know about segmenting populations down and kind of aiming particular messages at them, and the likelihood of those messages being heeded and acted upon are, within statistical margins of error. You can get a certain amount of number of people, a certain proportion of a number of people to do what you want based upon telling them stuff what to do. These are, and in effect, you are controlling their minds. So mind control technology, it exists. It's true. This guy's not full of absolute shit. It's interesting to take a wee look at him here. He's like the character design by Steve Yarwell is brilliant. He looks like an open university lecturer from the 70s. He looks like kind of an intelligent crackpot kind of thing. He also looks like, if you look at the moustache, is a bit off-putting, but if you look at the hair and the glasses, he looks like John Lennon. So it's quite a nice undercutting of all of the deification of John Lennon, literally, that we had in the previous episode, to kind of bring him down to earth a bit. It's a bit like, so this is the Lennon legacy in many ways. There's, there's a lot. Not that because of the kind of deification that we saw in the first issue meant that there wasn't perhaps need of a corrective, but if anything, like the kind of recent opinions on Lennon have gone back the other way a little bit too strongly, in my view. Yeah, he was a hypocrite. Yeah, he has some terrible views, but he also was like a wonderful songwriter and a wonderful voice in many ways, and was kind of like the richest revolutionary on the planet, was like providing money to the White Panthers and stuff, and genuinely was a more dangerous political figure than he was given credit for, I think. But also, if he was alive today, that's the kind of a thought experiment people like to have today, isn't it? What kind of music would Lennon be making now? What would he be like? What kind of a figure would he be? Maybe this. Dane doesn't look well. That's another thing to note here. He really doesn't look well. He's got big bags under his eyes and he's got spots. He's not got a happy look on his face. It's interesting to note that we're talking about ELF generators here, extremely low frequency, ELF. And another detail that's important on this page, this guy's kind of got it. He's realised what part of the fun of Speaker's Corner is. You go and kind of listen to what the crazy things that are being said are. It pains me to say this, but recently Speaker's Corner is a site where Islamophobic street movements, far right street movements go, and they kind of one of the justifications given for their absurd prejudice is the fact that I'm not allowed to say it because society prevents one from being racist and seeking their kind of the violent subjugation of a certain section of the population. Because society says you're not supposed to do that, doing that under the rubric of, under the disguise of free speech somehow gives it like a kind of a moral value. It obviously doesn't. Speaker's Corner is used by Tommy Robinson and his ilk to spread their political poison, their extremely dangerous and unpleasant views in places like Speaker's Corner. So Speaker's Corner is kind of, free speech can be used in principle, it's a good idea, but it can be used by scum as well as by decent people, it can be used by scum as well as people who are hoping to kind of elevate humanity. It can be used by those who don't wish to elevate humanity. And that's one of the main, that's where you see Speaker's Corner being used these days, because there's this kind of, despite the fact that, the British and American states are frequently spending their spare cash on bombing the hell out of Muslim countries and have very strict immigration laws around people from majority Muslim countries. Apparently, Islamophobia is verboten, and in order to be Islamophobic, you have to go to Speaker's Corner, where the kind of enshrined right to free speech allows one to be vile without fear of censure. And fuck that to a degree. Do you know what I mean? It's interesting to note that the Tyburn connection, And as much as Orwell thought that this was like a minor wonder of the world, the air here's poisoned, right? Like, there's death. The spectacle here is one of death, and sometimes things need to die so that better things can come along. But this is cursed ground to some degree. Final detail on this page is really interesting. There's as Dane walks off, realising that this guy's kind of annoying, maybe talking total nonsense. There's like this could be a child, but I don't think it is. I think it's a dwarf. I think it's a little person. And he's turning to watch Dale go. Something in his bearing makes me think it's not a child. So yeah, that's page 1. Really nicely laid out 5-panel page. Quite a lot of words, but not that many. And I'm skipping over like some of the our thoughts, our broadcasts. You can say what you like. There's a lot of between the lines stuff going on here. It's really well written. It's really smart, clever stuff. Okay, so we've got a splash page. Page 2, Down and Out in Heaven and Hell is the title of this chapter. Down and Out in Heaven and Hell is an elision. Okay, so let's go. Okay, I'd say he's probably on Oxford Street here. Like he's moved off not too far away from Speaker's Corner, and he's probably on Oxford Street now. That's where we are. The title, we got our credits here. Let's read those out. Let's give the people their due. Grant Morrison, writer. Steve Yowell, artist. Daniel Votso, colours. Electric Crayon, doing the digital colour separations. Lettering by Clem Robbins. Assistant editor Julie Rottenberg. Editor Stuart Moore. Invisibles created by Grant Morrison. Okay, we kind of know that, but it's worse now. Down and Out in Heaven and Hell. Yeah. That's the title. It elides Down and Out in Paris and London, the George Orwell book, with The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake, but also Heaven and Hell by Aldous Huxley. There's a lot to unpick here, actually. It seems just like, oh, I get it. We're just going to mash up 2 or 3 titles. But one of the things that I'm learning as I'm doing my little reread here is that it's like the invisible stuff in these issues is pointing the way towards something a bit deeper and cleverer than like this kind of like pop sci-fi conspiracy theory comic would than its reputation suggests. People think that The Invisibles is a cool comic, but they don't really take it terribly seriously. It's like doing something which is kind of more than surfacey clever. I think there's actually and like the depths are all kind of obvious, and that's okay because it's pop, right? But actually, maybe it's not. Maybe there's invisible depths here that are greater than the kind of the ones that you're supposed to look at and notice. Okay, so to kind of go to mash up Huxley and Orwell, these two kind of like famously dystopian sci-fi writers, with one of whom had a very one of whom was like a kick-ass revolutionary, another one, or at least a kick-ass anti-fascist, another one of whom loved taking acid, basically. You can see where the appeal kind of on the surface level for the kind of the icons and heroes that this comic wants to associate itself with. But really, like, and this is where we get a bit Adam Curtis maybe. You'd be tempted to say that there's an opposition which is kind of dialectical between Orwell and Huxley. Actually, I don't think there is. I don't think there's like a synthesis of Orwell and Huxley which tells us something about the way that culture and thought and society are structured. I think that actually there's just different ingredients to it. So upon the publication of what is probably Orwell's most famous book, 1984, certainly his most influential book, Huxley wrote saying, I really like your book, 1984. It's a bit like, he wrote to Orwell saying, I really like your book 1984. It's a bit like my book Brave New World, isn't it? I think my book Brave New World is better because your book doesn't have the stuff about pharmacopoeia being used to control people's thoughts. 1984 kind of looks at dystopia and social control through the lens of culture production and politics, whereas Huxley kind of comes at it from the level of what we would now call biopolitics, about using literal drugs and medicine to regulate the way that the human body works and control people that way. It's tempting because of the way that Orwell and Huxley specifically looked at the difference between those two novels to assume that there might be something in that they're not basically talking about a very similar control system. it's worth remembering that these are both Eton guys, right? They're kind of the school which has created more kind of like British prime ministers than any other, and still hideously influences British political life to this day. It's a posh old school called Eton. I think we'll probably get onto it when we explore other characters in The Invisibles. But Huxley and Orwell both went to Eton. Huxley was Orwell's teacher at Eton. There's the similarity between 1984 and Brave New World aren't coincidental in the least. They one was almost taught to the other, right? And both of them, if you kind of like take a snapshot of where we are today in terms of what a society of control looks like, there's very little opposition between Orwell and Huxley at all. They are, and the vision that we get from 1984 and the vision that we get from Brave New World, both of them, in terms of like the way that media control works and in the way that the big pharma is embedded into like political life and economic infrastructures, and the terrible kind of controlling, addictive, lowering, let's be honest, the degrading aspect that it has on our lives. They're just different parts of the same beast, really. Neither of, you couldn't write a novel which had the media control, the political control, and the biopolitics thing all in one go. That would be a bigger novel. But in reality, you've got both of these novels living side by side, and you and I are both living in them at the moment. And that's maybe what the kind of the bringing together of Orwell and Huxley is all about within this issue. And again, Orwell, right? Orwell. You know about Orwell. Like, Orwell's kind of badly served by the people who talk about him on the internet these days. They tend read some effing Orwell is like the battle cry of like sensible centrist Twitter. Ignore those people. There does appear to have been a kind of a critical misreading of Orwell and his meaning and his legacy, which, because he was a democratic socialist, they seem to think means he's a social democrat. And I think, and they just appear to be wrong about that. Social democracy is basically you let capitalism kind of take more and more power, and as long as there's kickbacks, buildings like in taxes, building schools, then we're good. Democratic socialism is about using representative parliamentary democracy to create a socialist society rather than one which is basically based on neoliberal capitalism like we've got now. These are different things. One is just like a way of managing capitalism, and the other one is a way of like replacing or kind of like superseding capitalism, right? One of them is a good thing, the other one isn't. One of them is basically Blairism, and I don't mean Eric Blair, i.e. George Orwell, I mean Tony Blair, and that's kind of another place where people's brains appear to have been really scrambled when discussing Orwell's legacy. Orwell's a much better writer than his champions would let you believe. He does, like, the way that he was a snitch. Let's not forget that. He did shop members of the British Communist Party into MI6. As I said, Orwell comes from Eton. He's very deeply embedded within what we would call now the deep state. The kind of the society of control and the way that operates within British class system and society. Like, Orwell is deeply in that and kind of comes from an era where people thought, hang on a minute, how about the deep state didn't necessarily have to be a capitalist one, and yet nevertheless would kind of reproduce the social relations within it fairly consistently. So if you think of the Invisibles as being something that can run along a straight line, it's probably not a terribly good way to think of it. It's probably better to think of it as a circle or a sphere. But if you were to think of it as a straight line, I think that the stuff that happens at the beginning becomes more relevant again and is more similar to the stuff that happens at the end. So stuff that happens in the middle is similar to the stuff that happens in the middle, and stuff that happens at the beginning and at the end is self-similar too. So I think the fact of Orwell as not the revolutionary but the rebel, and also the snitch, will be relevant further into the adventure towards the end. So that was a big digression, but we're still talking just about the title of the comic. I'm sorry, it's going to take for ages to get anywhere on this again, isn't it? Down and Out in Heaven and Hell. The second half of it is Heaven and Hell from Huxley's essay in 1956 or something, about 20 years after Down and Out in Paris and London, but he was older. and that's about kind of the way that the psychedelic experience relates to culture and the production of art, and the way that it's quite interesting the way that he goes into like fasting, or not even fasting, but just like lack of nutrition as being something which can kind of trigger unusual states of mind, which can lead to insight, not just artistic insights, but insights more generally that can lead to social transformation. Something that's kind of important to think about Orwell, Huxley rather, is his relationship to his grandfather, Thomas Huxley, who was famous as being the Darwin's bulldog, was how he was kind of known popularly. He is very much a key figure in the it's a progressive move in its own way, because it overthrew centuries of church dogma and whatnot, but he was very responsible within kind of like the UK academia and letters to make Darwinian evolution. You remember Kropotkin evolution based on Nietzsche and whatnot that we discussed last time. Darwinian evolution, which is survival of the fittest, competition as like defining characteristic of human social relations. It was Huxley's grandfather Thomas who was kind of very much responsible for having that become the dominant interpretation of Darwin's theories. So he was overturning like centuries of church dogma, which was a good thing, but he was also laying the groundwork for a kind of an intellectual framework that could allow competition as being the key factor, the key kind of like behaviour that should necessarily be the register and regulator of all other human affairs. So that feeds into the way that the Society of Brave New World works, feeds into the way that our society works, unfortunately. But that's kind of a key thing. Like, there's definitely like a kind of an intellectual lineage that Huxley is a representative of beyond just his own kind of writing and ideas, and that's that kind of chain of intellect. This, it's often referred to as like a silver chain that kind of connects ideas through the heads that have them down the centuries. Let's remember the way that the guy at the start was talking about thoughts as being things which transmit and kind of have an objecthood of their own, which doesn't necessarily sit with our kind of like anthropocentric ways of imagining and kind of psychological theories of where thoughts and memories come from and where ideas land and live, and the way they relate to the insides of our heads and the outsides of our heads. But yeah, there's a whole package of kind of associations being tied up in this use of Huxley and Orwell's intellectual traditions. Remember, like, the tradition between and the silver chain between Orwell and Huxley is as literal as you can get. One of them was the other one's teacher at school. Okay. And beyond all that, you have Blake, right? Heaven and Hell, the title of Huxley's essay, kind of comes from the marriage of Heaven and Hell from Blake, William Blake, Britain's, the world's perhaps greatest sort of visionary poet, a man who was able to take quite, he's very explicit and open about contact with different states of mind and being incredibly informative of his poetic sensibility, which also kind of plumbed intellectual and religious and ethical depths, which raised questions about early urban and bourgeois society that we're still very much living in the ruins of, if you like. His kind of thoughts about the way that personal and artistic freedom, or personal art freedom as it was expressed through art, kind of butted up against like straight society, or the society which used economics and commerce as its kind of and abstraction and measure as its primary kind of mode of expression, and his, which he kind of as a woodcutter, he was all too aware of the way that reproduction was a faithless process, the way that he made his money, was such as it was during his life, Blake, creating woodcuts which would then kind of be used to reproduce prints, and he was make pictures, make multiple copies of things, and he was aware keenly of how partial and kind of fuzzy a process that was, even though the whole kind of point of it was that it wasn't, and he was aware that there was a very kind of intellectually serious, potentially cataclysmic difference between the kind of the freeborn thought and the kind of the freedom of the soul of man, and the attempts to reproduce man and his culture and his ideas, and to abstract them to a register which could be measured and reproduced. This is a conflict which is very much at the heart, not just of kind of like British intellectual public life, but of the world's. These are serious philosophical questions, and this title Down and Out in Heaven and How, this title of the second issue of The Invisibles, is doing a lot of work bringing all of these thoughts together and kind of not seeking to kind of, maybe seeking to kind of dramatize a way through them, right? But it's more kind of raising questions than it is providing answers at this stage. On to page 3. So I think he's on Oxford Street. On to page 3. I think he's, even back in the mid-90s, these kind of boarded up, semi-derelict areas were not terribly easy to find in the immediate environs of Oxford Street. So let's assume that, Dane has travelled half a mile or so, and he's now in a slightly more insalubrious part of London, crouching in a boarded up doorway. And as the camera, and he's abject here. He's in, bless his heart, he's not having a good time. He's been begging on the first page. He's begging again, but he's doing so with an air of kind of resignation, which suggests that he's not been having a very good day of it. And it's very sad. This is very sad. This is, there was a time there where we thought we'd kind of maybe got a grip on or beated the problem of homelessness, and now it really looks like we haven't. And that's shitty. That sucks. But this was a problem in the 90s too, obviously. And as we move through, the camera pulls back, and we realise that, we obviously there's a contrast between the kind of the cold and the abjection of Dane's circus. I keep saying Dale instead of Dane because I'm thinking Dale Cooper rather than Dane McGowan. So apologies, bear with me. There's this woman here. This black woman is in a cafe drinking a nice warm cup of coffee, and it would have been a cafe, right? It wouldn't have been a coffee shop. Didn't really have those then. It's a cafe drinking a cup of coffee or tea, and she's there. I think anybody familiar with like the way that not just comic drama but like TV and film drama, as tempting as it would be to just be like, and here's like a random passerby, and the way that she and just as a kind of a dramatic contrast, I think we know that she's actually someone. I think you can just tell that by the way that she's appeared in the narrative at this point. She's not just a random person sitting there happening to kind of be ignoring this guy who's on the street. She's not doing that. Okay, so it's the next day. Dale's made it, or I presume it's the next day. Dane's made it through that horrible evening, bless him at least. You look really ill, Dane. You look terrible. Oh, let me find out that she's from Glasgow, so I've got to do a Scottish accent. You look really ill, Dane. You look terrible. You'll end up dead here and nobody will care. Why don't you just go back home to Liverpool? Same reason you don't go back to Glasgow. Anyway, the police will be after me since I ran away from Harmony House. I'm not doing the dialogue here. Everyone will hate me. So here's Dale. He's down in the underground, or an underpass, actually, it looks like more, because we follow this lady who was walking through a street. She does go down some stairs. Yeah, this is like the underground, but she's not in the underground yet. This is like a passageway to the tube. This punk girl with excellent eye makeup and spiky hair is she's from Glasgow. She's talking to Dane, who's from Liverpool. Neither of them are Londoners, remember. And we're kind of following this woman's perspective through the page. This lady is talking to Dane. He kind of gives us a quick rundown of where we are from now on, from the previous episode, rather. This lady approaches them and gives Dane some money. Eagle-eyed viewers will be rewarded with their attention by noting that this lady has bows in her hair. You can just about see them. She's got little bows in her hair. The lady who King Mob was talking to, who we discovered was called Ragged Robin, in the school scene in the first episode last time, she had bows in her hair. So this is her, right? So we get this now, and we're beginning to realise that as much as Dane is complaining about having been abandoned by the Invisibles, actually they're there. They're keeping an eye on him, and so maybe this person on the previous page, maybe that's an Invisible too, keeping an eye on them. These aren't spoilers, I don't think, but these are things that an attentive reader would be able to work out by themselves by now. that's kind of what, and she gives Dane a quid. And this lady here with the punky hair is actually quizzing Dane a little bit. She's saying to him, tell us about this bold guy. And before Dane gets a chance to kind of tell her about King Mob, the guy who kind of rescued and then abandoned Dane last issue. Forth from my far and darksome cell, or from the deep abyss of hell, Mad Tom is come to view the world again, to ease his poor distempered brain. Pluto laughs and Proserpine is glad to see poor naked Tom O'Bedlam mad. Pretty sure that's a line from King Lear. Tom O'Bedlam arrives. Okay, so this is the Tom who Gideon was talking to Edith, the old lady, about getting in touch with last episode. So we're aware now, really, if we're paying attention, that Dane's homelessness and his kind of like horrible reduced circumstances currently are part now of the Invisibles' plan for him. His initiation into their worldview. That's what it is. You know that better. Tom comes along. He's just a drunk homeless guy talking nonsense. Here he is, Tom O'Bedlam, Mad Tom. He's a character from English folklore, basically. There's a there's a bunch of kind of like anonymous poems from like the 17th century, 1640. I think the earliest one is dated to, but that's the kind of earliest one that we have a copy of. These are obviously songs or like oral tradition stuff previously. So going back probably into the 15th century. You've got Tom O'Bedlam as like a folk character. This is basically a guy who's kind of crazy, but kind of walking crazy, crazy enough to kind of get by, just about to kind of beg his way through survival, living on the streets and whatnot, would be kicked out of Bedlam, Bethlehem Hospital, in London, and not terribly close to where they are, which was kind of like the big medieval psychiatric wards, like lunatic asylum, whatever you want to kind of call it. It's where people who were crazy were thrown, and if you were crazy enough to be kind of allowed out to walk on your own cognizance, then you'd be abandoned to the streets. And those guys were known kind of as a group as Tom O'Bedlams, and also guys who kind of pretended to be like that to get out of working, and just kind of because they preferred like a mendicant lifestyle. There probably weren't many of them, let's be honest. There's a very fine line, as we're going to perhaps learn, between being mad and pretending to be mad. They would be known as Tom O'Bedlams too. Obviously, Edgar in Shakespeare's King Lear, adopts this persona of Tom O'Bedlam, of a Tom O'Bedlam, to escape notice from his wicked brother Edmund, and to impart kind of like, sacred crazy wisdom unto Lear himself as he's going through his own kind of breakdown, basically, and reconstruction. King Lear doesn't really get reconstructed. He just breaks down. So Tom comes along. He's got a bottle in his hand. He's proper drunk. He I don't know. Obviously, it's really tempting to kind of go deeply into his dialogue. What I'll probably do, I'll probably just post some links up to the anonymous Tom O'Bedlam poems that we have copies of now. Because some of them, like one of them in particular, they're just fantastic. They are like really wonderful, like visionary poetry from this period of English literature. There's a very kind of Ing-lit thing happening in this whole issue, as you kind of are probably getting a taste for. So Tom comes along. He's quoting lines from these poems, which are kind of doing two things. They're kind of saying this guy's crazy. They're saying he's imparting little bits of wisdom to Dane in code, which Dane isn't canny enough to notice yet, and which is actually kind of broad enough that you have to be reading quite carefully in, or quite generously in, kind of quite inaccurately in, arguably, to draw much of a line between what Tom is saying here and what this means for Dane. A lot of it is nonsense. We are learning that Tom is kind of crazy as well as drunk. There's quotations from these poems. Obviously, Shakespeare quoted from these poems in Lear too. So there's a lot of textual soup that our character Tom is spewing back up at us here. There's allusions to evil spirits, flippity-gibbet, who's like a genuine kind of like spirit that was attested for in an account of a kind of a 15th century, 16th century exorcism. He's mixing this up with like street language, white seedless grapes, 99p a pound. This is just something you'd hear from a market trader or see in the window of a supermarket or something, corner shop. And he's drunk. He's drunk, he's talking about drinky drink. It's a great entrance. He's like, it is worth picking through his dialogue because it's just lifted from these poems pretty much, and it's beautiful. You sing like jellyfish pretty soon now. I don't know what that is. I think that's you sing like a jellyfish pretty soon now. I might Google that as well. But Tom's here. He's full of it. He's well pissed up. He's crazy, and in his craziness lies wisdom. The eliding of insanity here with wisdom is, shall we say, problematic. Okay, having mental health difficulties doesn't give you access to special wisdom. Sorry, it doesn't work like that. It's a nice romantic notion to be able to hold that helps people who don't have mental illness problems kind of somehow mitigate their feelings of sympathy, to be like, oh, well, perhaps this guy's got access to wisdom and that's making him happy. Nah, not really. Being sane is better. You could still be sane and wise. You don't have to be crazy and wise. And another thing that's kind of working its way here is that, what am I trying to say with this? That, it's worth thinking about Orwell again, and this kind of an Edgar from Lear, and this kind of pretending to be crazy, or pretending to be homeless, and using that to gain higher, different perspectives. This is just a deconditioning technique, right? You take away someone's social and material circumstances, they gain a different perspective on the world. They just do. You can use that perspective for art or magic. And Orwell did this, and and Orwell used it to his credit to kind of gain a perspective about life, a poverty-stricken life that he wasn't, as a kind of a comfortable middle-class guy, wasn't aware of. The phrase "a cheap holiday in somebody else's misery" should come to mind at this point, because it's worth looking at that from the other side and thinking, is there any kind of authenticity in, being able to, within a certain level of safety, eschew one's material conditions and take a walk on the wild side and use that to, sell basically as literature. There's issues here. I think kind of the social good that you can get from the sharing that perspective with other people, other kind of housed, non-poverty stricken working class, middle class, upper class people, that Orwell was able to do, mitigates it and makes it okay, makes it a good thing on balance. But there are levels and layers to this that, it's not enough to say, hey guys, if you're feeling like you need to get a better perspective on life, why not just like pretend to be homeless for a few days and go and sleep on a park bench? That's not obviously the same as having to live on a park bench, right? And kind of the appropriation of that as a thing is, again, I'm just going to say it's problematic, right? There are ethical and moral questions about whether that is an okay thing for somebody to do. And certainly for somebody to do and then kind of award themselves the right to talk as if from that position, okay? Like sleeping on a park bench for a few days isn't the same as, because you can go back to mum and dad's house, isn't the same as being homeless. And there's an ethical complaint here, is that, we saw last week, Dane comes from poverty-stricken working class, not poverty-stricken, but from very poor working class background. And to kind of almost teach him the lesson of not being attached to material goods is kind of something that middle class or bourgeois people might do, which Dane arguably doesn't need to know. He kind of maybe knows that already. We'll learn more about the characters, which will kind of make that, put that into light a bit later perhaps, but at the moment just let's note the similarity between what Dane is going through, what Tom's life is like, and what Orwell did in order to produce some of his very socially useful and brilliantly written works, like Downlight in Paris and London being like the main one. There are elements of it in the Road to Wigan Casino as well. Okay, next page, over we go. I reckon that this is in the city somewhere. I think Dane is kind of maybe on a broadly eastward trajectory throughout this episode. He comes to this boutique here, Planet X, and he bungs a bin through the window and goes, bastards, because he's kind of, why does he do that? Because obviously one of the things that you notice about when you see poverty in London is that it's sitting side by side with extremes of wealth. And this is like a swanky boutique where these clothes on sale are kind of ridiculously overpriced, and there's a legitimate like resentment to be had there, noting the kind of the disparity of wealth and affluence and poverty in the street, and it's okay for Dane to be pissed off about that. Also, you'll note that like these are faceless and also bald mannequins, and he's not just saying sort of like rich people are bastards or kind of like fashionistas are bastards. There is a bit of him here that is thinking that particular bold bastard who dumped me on the streets, he's a bastard. So there's a lot of like legitimate targets for Dane's anger here. It's also interesting that like the boutique is called Planet X. You've probably heard of Planet X or Nibiru, the kind of the so-called 10th planet in our solar system, which maybe is the home of aliens and many cosmic influence upon our evolution and destiny and culture and the way that humans think and be and do and are. You may probably already have an opinion on that. It's kind of worth noting that, like, I'm like you. I only read the headlines really, so I'm not sure whether their headlines were kind of then like debunked or contextualized or kind of that's rubbish. But as far as I'm aware, there does appear the latest astronomical data does tend to suggest that there is or could very well be a massive kind of like planetary-sized or larger, like big planet-sized body in the solar system that we haven't actually seen yet, whose presence would account for orbital irregularities that we can observe in the planets, right? So we know, like you can get a picture of like mass exerts gravity on other mass, and you should be able to work out from the observable massive bodies where the orbiting paths of the planets around the sun should go. There appears to be irregularities that would be explained by the presence of another planet that we haven't seen, of a 10th planet, like Planet X or Nibiru. Planet X obviously means 10, but the X also means for we don't know. It also means alien. Yeah, that X is a symbol throughout history for things which are far out. Alien, also kind of religios, if you like, to do with entities from beyond the mere Earth, for which X is also a symbol. Like the weird cosmic Earth, maybe just another way of having Earth. Yeah. And he bungs a bin through the window, smashes it, and when he does, he is spotted by a copper, and he legs it through the city. It's interesting that we've got these kind of the action happens in these spaces, right? In these pages, action happens. Like there's been kind of like a lot of chat, and the action starts. But normally, action is where the action is, hence the name, right? But actually, this isn't. This is kind of empty a bit. This is where you get some breathing space. Like the action is happening in the dialogue. It is happening in the story, and this little scrote running away from a dumb copper isn't it's an action scene, but there's not much action happening. It's not terribly dramatic, right? So actually what's happening here is that despite there being like activity, the narrative is pausing and allowing the reader a few moments to kind of like just chill a little bit. Dane does run past a bookies, a bookmakers, and a adult bookstore. So that's to suggest that he's in Soho probably. He's quite in central London still. And both of the things that he runs past are kind of gambling and and sex work. They're both things which kind of require human liberty, but also kind of have quite well understood and easily understood areas where they shade into exploitation, right? So, gambling and sex work are both things that, consenting adults should be allowed to do, but also there are spaces within those activities where exploitation can very easily happen and do very easily happen. So they're places where the fine line of human liberty becomes sharp for good reason, right? And he's legging it from the copper. The copper's catching him, and he gets grabbed and dragged into a alleyway, and it's Tom. And Tom goes, shush, shush, shush. And the copper comes down, and he's like, what's going on here? Where's that kid? Where's that kid? And even though Dane is standing just there, Tom's like, don't know what you mean. I haven't seen anybody. Nobody's been down here. And basically, the copper kind of turns around and goes away. And Dane's like, what the hell's going on? Tom is there doing his, he's kind of just like playing dumb, being like a harmless drunk guy, talking to the copper. The copper kind of gets befuddled and just sort of wanders off. Yeah, right, little bastard must have just got away somehow. And he does a little bit more of his Swithin footed thrice the world, and met the nightmare and her ninefold, another line from one of the Tom of Bedlam poems, which has a nice occulty angle. The copper wanders off over the page. Now like this. Over the page, we've got an advert for the Books of Magic, which was like, the pre-Harry Potter comic. And this advert is just hilarious. He's basically just looking at the electric magic jizz on his hand as he's like had his first masturbatory experience. I never read this comic, The Books of Magic. It's all about like a young man turning into a young boy turning into a teenager, but adolescence is magic, right? I never read this comic, and it does just look like the biggest load of shit. But in the way these things do seem to converge, or as I prefer to think of it, in the way that the Invisibles does just exert like a magnetism around everything around it, and it does drag things into that irregular orbit. This could easily be Dane, right? He's going like Tim Hunter, I think his name was, is going through his own initiation, just as Dane is going through a slightly more kind of street and edgy and cool one. But the words we have on this advert here are new neighbours, girl trouble, mystical assassins, childhood is hard to give up, sacrifices. That's kind of what's going on with Dane. All of those things are in the Invisibles. It's just not as cringy and kind of and like nicely, quaintly middle class. Over on page 9, Dane's like, what the hell just happened there? How the fuck did you do that? Did you hypnotise him or something? Tom says quite straightforwardly, I made you invisible. I was the one. It's magic, that's what. The Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. Modo, he's called, and Mahu. Again, these are lines from Witch Trial Confessions, I think, which found their way into, the Tom of Bedlam poems. Modo is a spirit of murder. Mahu is a spirit of theft. So he's saying, I'm doing this with magic, and he's quite open about how he's doing it with magic, and he's using, genuine spirits, magical allies to help him do it. And he's taken these old kind of like folk figures, these old spirits that are attested to as authentic entities within folk culture, within British magic, right? Within, I'm talking about magical spirits. Tom uses them to make Dane invisible long enough for the copper to go away. Magic, you're a fucking nutcase. Then keep well away, for madness is catching. So if thoughts aren't just things that are locked up in your head, but are kind of objects which can be broadcast at you, then yes, then madness can be catching, right? Away, the foul fiend follows me. Wait. And then Dane's like, you're a nutcase, but basically, yeah, he needs a friend at the moment. This guy's obviously been on the streets for a long time, knows how to make people invisible to coppers. A useful guy to be friends with. Dane obviously really needs a friend at the moment, as well as obviously like a mentor. And there's a cool bit here. So Tom's been this kind of like nice, kind of like harmless, annoying character heretofore. But at this stage, he has a little bit of a Yoda moment in the final period. You know the bit in Empire Strikes Back where Luke goes, I'm not scared, just as he's about to undergo his Jedi training. Well, and Yoda goes, you should be scared. Here's the same scene. Like Tom is going, I'm going to give you your magical apprenticeship, but you're not going to enjoy it. But it's better than just, being homeless on the streets, right? We get a quick example of magic here. Tom is still doing, like, if you want to discuss any of the kind of the quotations and how they refer to the action underneath in the comments below, I would love to engage with people on that. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, I'm not going to go through every little allusion that Tom makes in his speech, because there's tons of it. It's beautiful. It's really good fun. And it does and doesn't apply very closely to what's going on in the action of the narrative, right? Some of it's really relevant. Some of it's just tossed off. We get a really good example of concrete magic here, practical magic, sorcery, good old-fashioned, I want to do a thing, sorcery. And what you do is you go up and you drop a riddle on a rich man, and the best riddles aren't riddles, they're just open flatnesses. And he says, I'm hungry and I'm an alcoholic and I need money to buy booze with, please. And a kind of a harmless looking yuppie guy goes, oh yeah, okay, gives them a tenner, and they don't spend the tenner on booze, even though I'm sure Tom would like to. They spend it on fish and chips, which is nice. £10, look at that. There's the Queen smiling too. The Queen lives on money. We might get into stuff like that later as well. See, there's magic. You were hungry, now you've a nice bag of fish and chips. All he had to do was throw some magic words at a yuppie, and now suddenly these two homeless guys have gone from having empty stomachs to full ones. Stick with me, boy. I'll show you how to stay alive in this hard and hungry world. It's been raining. And then he goes, and see, the rain's off too. That's me did that. Kind of like London's most famous street magician, Austin Osman Spare. His kind of trick was to draw a squiggle and to make it rain. He used to enjoy doing that to the bemusement of punters in pubs in South London. And this is kind of referring to that, I think. The real magic is in going, is in taking credit where credit isn't due, right? That's the really smart move, is to say, oh, I made it stop raining when it stops raining. So we can presume that they were sort of between Soho and Westminster at this point, because when we see them again shortly afterwards, they are in Parliament Square in Westminster. That's Big Ben. That's a statue of Churchill. But this is the Invisibles, the kind of the real textual meat, the stuff that you want to know about and should be paying attention to, is the stuff that you want. Like, and we know, we can see that it's Churchill because he says it's Churchill and it's written down on the statue Churchill. That's not what's important about this page. This guy here is Jan Smuts, South African politician, 1870 to 1950. Okay. This statue, the one that's actually poking its head into the speech bubble where they say, I'll show you things to make your hair stand up and dance if you really want to learn. Smuts was a South African politician who's got a statue in Parliament Square. Obviously a fairly heavy dude, right? He believed in holism, which isn't like holism as in like thinking about things holistically in the way which is kind of useful for like just thinking about systems and stuff now, and which is kind of, new agey kind of. Sorry, I don't mean to discuss holistic thinking. That's dismiss holistic thinking. But his holism was a bit different. It was more about like a tendency within things to evolve into wholes, into wholenesses. And he was a political philosopher specifically. So he really means the way he kind of means villages become towns, become cities. He means the tendency for political objects to accrete and gather together into larger forms. So he means counties, countries, continents, kind of thing. He's talking about states, multilateral agreements between states, and then kind of like formal state apparatuses, like transnational state apparatuses. So that's kind of what his political philosophy was about. Now, what does that sound like to you? I haven't explained it terribly well, so I'm going to forgive you for not getting it. Sorry, before we do that, quick aside, still a segregationist, right? Like a liberal segregationist, not as bad as some of the hardliners in the Afrikaans community in South Africa, kind of in the first half of the 20th century. But he believed that things evolved into holes, into wholenesses, except black people, like not them. So we don't like. He was by far not the worst of all South African politicians, but don't go around thinking that Jan Smuts is like he's like a cool guy to hang out and have a drink with, because I reckon you're going to be disappointed. I reckon a couple of glasses of sack in, he's going to be he's going to be talking about the darkies and stuff, and it's not going to be nice. Apologies for my language there. So let's go back a little bit, right? Let's go back to our first page. Remember John Lennon from the Open University here. He lays it out very clearly what the Invisibles is about. Low frequency magnetic fields blanket broadcast by our masters in the New World Order. The reason that Jan Smuts has his statue in Parliament Square is because he was a keen his kind of like political achievement was the League of Nations, which is kind of obviously the precursor organization to the United Nations, which is obviously the kind of the, at this time certainly, the home of the New World Order, and the kind of the wellspring of like the evil globalist monoculture, which the conspiracy guys, the bad guys, were going to enforce upon the population of the world at large. The one world government, the novus ordo seclorum, the New World Order, right? Smuts, as much as anybody in history, is responsible for doing the legwork to make that administrative structure exist. Okay, that's why there's a statue of Smuts in this panel right here. That's why, like, it's funny that Tom's taken a piss on the Churchill statue, and we know about Churchill. We know that he's an intensely problematic figure himself, was like a very, very bad man who happened to kind of like come into himself when there was a much worse man who needed defeating, and he was instrumental in doing that defeating. And that means that, he's not the worst guy. And he did do a really good thing in the way that he was kind of able to ride Soviet coattails to smash fascism. That's kind of, he was like, you don't need me to tell you that Churchill was terrible. But also Churchill is a bit punk, right? We'll have discussions in later episodes about the kind of the conservative nature of punk. Punk is like saying what you want and not giving a fuck, and its essence, and that's Churchill, right? That, like, Churchill is very punk, and this was kind of made literal during the kind of the 2010 protests. I think actually maybe before that. Was it maybe in the anti-capitalist protests of the end of the 20th century? I don't know. Anyway, there's a famous picture. I'll dig it out. Churchill with like a green stripe in his hair of like some kind of protesters going, "Oi, Winston, back off," and painting his hair green as if to be like, "Look, establishment figure, punk, aren't these things very, very different?" No, then they're kind of not. Johnny Rotten's a landlord. Lots going on here about the way that rebellion and reaction are in a dynamic. Yeah, that's what this is about. Tom takes a piss against Churchill, so again, he's kind of that's a sign of disrespect. But he's also saying, he also says, "I'm watering it so little Winstons may spring up, spouting speeches. Cities aren't what you think. See, if you make it past the first ordeal, I'll tell you what cities really are and what they want." So this sign of disrespect is a Churchillian act in itself, and will maybe give rise to more Churchills, including this potential Churchill, as in like leader of things, who Tom is taking under his wing at the moment. Jan Smuts is the statue that you can see here, and he's one of the guys from the New World Order. That's what needs to be said about this page. We got some nice dialogue between Tom and Jack. Tom is showing that he's very insightful and has got lots of understanding of Jack's situation, including Jack Frost, who you'd have to be a very attentive and kind of like instinctual reader to get this, but Jack Frost is probably that thing, the vision thing that was hovering behind Jack's head just after Dane's head just after he saw the dead Beatles, after he saw Lennon and Sutcliffe in the last episode. Okay, who's Jack Frost, boy? What? I don't know, do I? Why don't you just fuck off and leave us alone? I can survive on my own if I have to, you'll see. Tom knows a lot of stuff. He knows about the weird visions that Dane has. Sorry, the visions of Jack that Dane has. Next page, page 12, he's flogging the big issue. Not having much luck. Some kind of like a banker, city guy, just like strolls past him, says, no thanks, don't want to buy the big issue. The big issue is like it's like a paper that homeless people sell to make a bit of money for themselves. Everyone knows their local big issue seller, probably, hopefully. Again, the big issue is not a straightforwardly good thing. It kind of, in my view, it makes you shouldn't have to work to not be homeless, basically. Like, not being homeless should just be something that everyone can take for granted. And I'm a hopeless lefty utopianist for thinking that or whatever. The big issue teaches homeless people that they have to work to not deserve their homelessness, and I don't agree with that. And it's contrary to the principles of mutual aid that Kropotkin espoused, remember him from the last episode, and which stand very much in opposition to the kind of dominant forms of Darwinian evolution that we live under, that we're kind of more familiar with now, and that Kropotkin very importantly undermines. We're getting examples of mutual aid, by the way. Mutual aid, I don't know if we went into this last episode, but mutual aid is basically cooperation, not competition, being like the definitive human character trait. If you like, it's not to say that competition isn't natural or a behaviour that people do and want to do, just that it's not as important to keeping people happy and healthy than cooperation. In order to get out of bed and turn the light on, you're engaged in a series of trusts with people that when you flick that switch on, the light's going to come on and you could be able to start your day, and your day continues like that. You're much more subject to cooperations than you are competitions in order to get the life that you want to have. In my view, and not just in my view, that's obviously right. This idea that competition is the definitive characteristic of human relations is a thought that's been put into your head by rich dudes to make them richer, and so that you'll keep spending your money on their stuff. That's, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to think that. You just have to understand capitalism. Mutual aid, in effect, this glamorous figure here gives Dane some money. Again, just like being a bit reedy, by just having a set of eyes in your head, you'll be able to recognise that this character here, just the way that they're coloured and the way they leap out of the page and the way they have some dialogue, probably isn't just a random bypasser, probably is another one of these invisible characters who are keeping an eye on Dane, right? You should have worked that out by now. Now, we have an example of Dane's transphobia, although he actually expresses it as homophobia. Remember, he is just a working class boy from Liverpool and kind of not terribly reconstructed. Yeah, he's homophobic, and it's interesting that it's interesting. Like, you wouldn't do that, right? You would have a character, if you were kind of writing a boring comic, you would have a character who didn't need to have his mind changed. What this goes out of his way to tell us is that Dane does need to have his mind changed. He has got a lot to learn. He's not like a kind of an innocent blank slate waiting to be kind of just like step into himself and be given a chance and kind of become like a rad ledge. He's actually got some problems that need to be addressed, and he, let's sit with him and watch him learn, right? Tom is much more enlightened. He says, man, woman, so what? That, like, when you're thinking about LGBTQ issues, I'm just a straight white guy. I'm a straight sexual guy. You don't listen to me too much, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Man, woman, so what? And still on page 13, unlucky for some, what happens next is we see another punk, perhaps another homeless person, running. They're coming, run! And next thing we know, Tom says, oh, we've got to get out of the way, because these hunters, these are like old school fox hunters, kind of from this is what posh people in Britain do on the weekends. They go on high days and holidays anyway. I'm recording this between Christmas and New Year's Eve, and This is something that happens a lot on Boxing Day. This is the day after Christmas Day itself. The upper classes enjoy themselves by murdering innocent animals. It's not murder, but by hunting and killing. Not just hunting like bang, you're dead, but like chasing down foxes traditionally, but also deer for fun. And this is what these guys here are dressed up as. And what we have here, and over the next 2 or 3 pages, before we move on, note this one here could be a child, but again could be a little person, a dwarf. Maybe not for the first time in this issue, right? So we've got, they're wearing top hats or riding hats. They're obviously, minus the horses and the dogs, these are hunters. You know, they're out to, hunt homeless people, it looks like. And that's pretty awful. Tom is scared of them, and we know that Tom kind of knows how to survive on the streets. So if he's scared of them, then they're obviously scary. And again, we have another chase, like more literally this time even. Like, not only is Dane being chased by the copper, but this other homeless woman is being chased by a whole bunch of hunters, and we have it for. Can you see that? Yeah, and we have it for 2 whole pages again. A big spread ending with the very unfortunate death of this woman as she tries to, she trips over rubbish. These guys kind of seem to emerge through a milliner's, a hat shop, and she is banging on this door marked private. She's sought to make a chase through public space, but has come up against a door ostentatiously marked private, which means she's not allowed to go through there. Obviously, she can't get it open, and they are round on her and and they kill her. You know, they've got big knives, and they say, "Thrill of the chase, you've led us a merry dance, haven't you, you little vixen?" Vixen obviously is the female form of a fox. And cut off the breasts to blood the children. Oh, actually, perhaps the little person there is a child, actually, because they're going to cut this poor girl's breasts off to wipe the blood on the face of the children, which is a real thing that happens in hunting rituals. And they finish off as her blood hits the bricks with who's for champagne. But again, we've had a big dense period of dialogue and ideas coming at you, stuff being said and done. And actually, the effect, as kind of as sinister as this is, and it's very dramatically kind of like presented. This is a bit of a breather. This is an action thing, which kind of is not the action that we're supposed to be paying attention to in this issue, and it actually provides us with a little bit of space to get our heads back together based on what we've just known. And that takes up 2 whole pages. That takes up pages 14 and 15, and that brings us to 16, where it's sometimes later, and we're underground. Tom is taking Dane to this abandoned tube station, underground railway station. This is the buried London boy, the city's dark twin I told you about. Our destinations reached by secret processional ways, obsolete subway tunnels, the cellars of long demolished buildings, lost stations and stairways. Sometimes down here you can hear engines running and see blue lights flicker on tiled walls, strange trains clattering through the dark, with what passengers, what freight. Like ghosts, you mean? So what are we doing down here? It's a place of initiation. We've always had our caves and deep places, labyrinths and mazes. So, Tom's brought Dane here to go through some kind of initiation. Obviously, underground spaces are kind of traditional spaces for initiation in kind of all sorts of human cultures. The underground space kind of represents the human subconscious, and the things that one might be able to be brought into reckoning with in there. These, the kind of the dramatization of these kind of ritual spaces actually does have a effect itself on human consciousness. Like going underground does make you see things differently and does make you feel like different things are possible to happen to you. There's maybe an idea there that caves, tunnels, underground places like this are lost, abandoned places where the sun doesn't shine, where the sun can't penetrate, is also kind of closed off to the eye of God, if you like, to the all-seeing eye of the over-God. And the reason that one is taken almost into the dark spaces, into the tunnels, is to realise that is one of the realisations that one can have there, is that the that eye, that seeing thing, that ego that sees, that does you, comes with you when you go into these dark spaces, that although they maybe are hidden from the kind of the all-seeing eye of the sun, they're not hidden from the all-seeing eye of the self. And one of the things that one learns is how to be conscious of the fact that one is taking that with oneself. They're going down this thing and they're in this tunnel. It's an old abandoned tube tunnel. I mean, thinking of like the kind of the subterranean rhizome of London space, these caves, tunnels, caverns, old railway, stairways and things are like, not only like London has been built on for thousands and thousands of years. It's a very old place, and the old rivers and streams and the levels of building over time have the underground of London is obviously a kind of uncatalogued and unknown, except maybe some guys in Churchill's war room or whatever, but also enormous, massive, and like all kind of like root networks and kind of subterranean systems, it sustains the thing above it with nutrients and energy somehow. We get this kind of totem guy. This is the spirit of the space that they're in, the kind of the genius loci, if you like, the genius locus, I suppose, guardian of this shrine, totem and protector. It's basically some old railway sleepers or maybe a bit of tree, some wood, kind of in a rough crucifix shape. What's really great about the picture here is that although it's illuminated, because it's illuminated by Tom's torch, his flashlight, the way that it's been drawn and inked, the shadow of it and the thing itself kind of blend into one another. So you can't really see terribly well what the totem shrine protector is made of. It looks to be made of some wood, an old telly, some railway sleepers. It's obviously like a torn up railway track as well to some degree, and a telly and a bicycle wheel, some rope. It's a right old mixed bag of nuts. Kind of suitable products for the place, but also kind of forming a cross, this very kind of old symbol of all the things I said earlier. This is where we all come when it's our time. So we're getting a sense now that the Invisibles are a established, or at least kind of like long-lived organisation where people like Tom will initiate do initiations for new members like Dane. And the reason that they come here, okay, so this is where we get into kind of like urban legend territory again. They come down here for the blue mould. Oh, where is it? There, for the blue mould that Tom scrapes off the wall. Now, this is kind of this kind of goes back to like London stoner lore, basically, that the in Ladbroke Grove, the hippie communities in the 60s and early 70s kind of had these stories of particular mosses or molds or fungus that, magic mushroom kind of things that you could that only grew in certain places in the London Underground, old abandoned train tunnels like this. This is what this is really about. And obviously you got the best high there. What this is really about is the fact that among all of those things that I spoke of earlier, these underground spaces that exist in London, one of the most kind of like spooky ones, if you like, are the plague pits, right? These mass burial grounds. There are squillions of dead bodies under London. Remember the dead bodies that we were talking about in Tyburn earlier at the start of the episode. The mysticism of a space comes from the death there. So this is like the idea that like one could get high on mushrooms that have been growing on the bodies of plague victims, okay, and that would kind of like have extra special getting high qualities, man, which does sound kind of awesome and scary. And as we're about to find out when Dane and Tom get up to it, it's a pretty cool trip. This obviously also ties itself back to so like the idea that the kind of the consciousness that seems to be coming through entheogen experiences, like taking hallucinogenic plant matter, is in some way caused by the nourishment, the consciousnesses of the nourishment of the bodies that those things have come from. So you're partaking of the consciousness of the earth, but also of the consciousness of the things that have been on the earth, and one realizes that those are maybe not separate things. That's one of the things of this issue, right? realizing that things that may look like they're separate aren't, like heaven and hell. What's that? Can you get wrecked on it? Apparently you can get wrecked on it. They scrape it off the wall, they stick it in Tom's little pipe, and they start to smoke it. So what's this stuff? It smells a bit funny, like perfume or something. Tom says, once London was Luandun, city of the moon. The moon's a door, they say. Gateway of resurrection, threshold of life, threshold of death. Smoke, watch, wait. Obviously, this is the second issue of the comic. Remember the smoke coming off King Mob's gun in the first issue? How that had a really nice touch of like computer kind of like colouring on it, which was all a bit blurry and fuzzy and kind of had a nice Hornto charge. The colorists haven't had as much time in this second episode, this second issue, because we're kind of into it now. But the smoke doesn't have a kind of a nice that nice smudgy effect, but it does have a kind of a nice bubbly clarity of line to it. Like they Steve Yoel and the inking guys and the colorists are still doing nice little work on this smoke that Tom and Dane are having and getting high off. Smoke, watch, wait. Hey, and then the trip starts to kick in, and we get this excellent little sequence here. We get a word appearing in we get this word barbalith appearing as graffiti on the walls of the station. The paint, we are told, is still wet, so it's been freshly done, but we're not sure by who. Barbalith is a word that apparently Grant Morrison experienced in a dream once, and went on to become the name of like the Invisibles fan forum that was kind of grew up around the comic. Hello there, by the way, to you. Barbalith means roughly bearded, barbalith stone. So like a stone with a beard. Beards are cool. A wise stone, the wisdom of the stones, the knowledge of the, something like that maybe. Stones are old and alive is what the word barbalith means. And Dane's kind of nice visual trip starts to get well intense. And who are these guys? They're grey aliens. They're like classic grey aliens, and they he undergoes this kind of like abduction experience, this kind of very kind of classical abduction experience in many ways. What we're getting. So these guys, right? So they're grey aliens, right? And you're probably aware of like the Jacques Vallée's kind of extra-dimensional or ultra-dimensional hypothesis, that is that the alien visitors, they're not from outer space, they're from sideways space, they're from another dimension rather than from, or another time, or another kind of layer of reality than necessarily from just like a planet over there. And they don't come in like metal ships, they come kind of through light-like portals. This is probably a theory that's you're fairly familiar with. It's certainly something which is very widely held about little green space aliens now, is that I think most people think that they aren't just space aliens, because they do connect to these kind of what you would really have to describe as spiritual encounters that existed and are attested to throughout human history and across most human cultures. So obviously, if we go back to the beginning of the episode, you remember the guy talking about the elf generators? Okay, these are elves, okay? And they've been generated. So an elf generator looks like this. A totem or a shrine or a protector. Is this a home that the spirits of the elves dwell inside? Or is it a doorway through which the spirits or the elves or the aliens come through into our world? Is it an inside or an outside? We find throughout this trip experience that the concepts like inside and outside are being folded against each other. The body and the mind, the surface and the deeps, these things are being brought together, or at least, if not being brought together, being brought apart in such a way that you can recognize with clarity the similarity that they may have, right? We get this is nicely kind of illustrated here in that we've got circles. There's the kind of the obviously like circles means circularity and return and recurrence, and that seems to be the bit that Dane is focusing on in his trip. The kind of the eye, the dot of the eye, right? The kind of the center of the ego. And that kicks off these kind of like circular motifs that are happening through his trip. We get these red lights, which is then followed by a green light. We get these eyes. We also get this button, which is being pushed, but also kind of flicked off of someone's jacket. Now, if you kind of go into the rest of the issue, you can see what Tom and Dane are wearing, and neither of them appear to be missing a button, right? So this is all a bit kind of artistic-y licensing. Like, neither of them have actually lost a button. But what this does is that, Dane has quite a kind of an elongated process of meeting in a very kind of up close and personal fashion these aliens. They appear to be taking him at some point down for a bit of like the old alien implant surgery. And it all also seems to be happening in about the length of time that it takes for a button to be flicked off your shirt and fall to the floor. So time, as long as all of those other things that I just mentioned, the insides and outsides and the spaces and the times, are all being folded into one another. And also the kind of the shape of the thread between the holes at the center of the button, the kind of the crisscross effect that has appears to be influencing the facial features of the aliens too. And this kind of will remind us of Huxley's thesis in the Heaven and Hell essay, that elements of the psychedelic experience are they're deeply connected to our apprehension of material reality, and the fact that we apprehend them differently creates all sorts of different kind of like phases of consciousness and associations, which give us knowledge and insights which can be of like practical evolutionary value, things which have actually kind of helped the species in its survival and progress. And it's a great little sequence. It's really good, really tight, sharp comic storytelling. It doesn't do anything too formal, like what I really like about it is the way that it takes up about half the page, and it's kind of only just like the overture of Dane and Tom's trip, but or really just Dane's trip, I think. But it doesn't like the kind of the formal scheme. It starts to kind of shift through the page rather than dominating the page, if you see what I mean. So we get all of this meat, and it's just packed into the bottom third of this page, and it's quite ballsy comic storytelling, especially the way that it uses the grid, and the way that the grid is kind of like blurred and not blurred at certain different points, and we get these shifting perspectives and close-ups. It's cool. It's good comics, right? So we're deep in the middle of this trip. Dane's just been abducted by aliens, and then all of a sudden, boom, we're back in the room, or at least we're back on the streets of London. These green traffic lights are being represented as a motif again. Those of you who follow Twin Peaks and David Lynch will be familiar with the fact that traffic lights can kind of signal some kind of liminal shift. That's, like there's a lot of David Lynch in The Invisibles. There's a lot of, David Lynch this was kind of his imperial phase, if you like, where he was kind of like the toast of the world, and his style was universally acknowledged to be damn good, and a lot of people were copying it, or at least copying it, inspired by it, But we've also got these airships here. They look a bit like barrage balloons that one would have had floating over Second World War London, kind of like balloons which were sort of designed to stop bombs dropping on things. I mean, really, did those things actually happen? But yeah, airships over London, like a Michael Moorcock book, or World War II London. Moorcock's kind of visions of what his kind of alternative London universes could look like, and the kind of the preponderance of airships as a motif in his work is based upon his experiences as a child during the Blitz. How do you feel those lights look amazing? Where did those airship things come from? Dane asks, not unreasonably. And Dane says, there's something not right about this place. And Tom says, this is their city. They watch over it. They're angels, see? So the elves generated are maybe angels also. And maybe they live in these ships. And, it's not weird, despite the kind of the fact that saucers appears to be the kind of the dominant shape of alien spacecraft, inner spacecraft, outer spacecraft. Like this cigar shape, this elongated thing, airship thing, is very much like the second most commonly reported UFO shape. These airships are angels, or they're the ships that the angels, these elf guys from the previous page, these alien angel guys from the previous page, fly in and watch over the city with. Remember that an angel, in kind of like, strictly speaking, is a messenger of God, like brings God's word to people. Pardon me. But also, yeah, they're spaceships and they're there. And what's kind of interesting about this is that it implies a bit more than just like a trip, right? Like your trip doesn't need to have an infrastructure that can create an airship, right? And yet this trip has airships in it. So this trip is realer. It has a past that extends beyond your participation in it, your journey on the trip. And also, airships are a kind of a staple of current day conspiracy law, right? Like, I'm not saying that they're definitely directly inspired by this, but it's worth noting that kind of around this time, the thoughts around the mid 19th century American airship flap and the subsequent disclosures about the Sonora Air Project. Basically, this is kind of like breakaway civilization stuff. That there's this kind of idea that's kind of very current in conspiracy law that there is a secret society or a secret kind of organization that has better tech than the stuff that we have, right? And they exist to the point where it kind of constitutes a different civilization, that kind of a layer of technological capability and kind of ideological outlook, which kind of sits above the society that you and I know about, and that these groups of people who maybe number 10,000, who maybe number 100,000, have access to kind of technology which is either kind of inspired by, which is either kind of salvaged from like Nazi UFO projects, or kind of Nazi UFO projects were salvaged from pre-existing projects that kind of were maybe based around German communities in like the American desert way back into the middle of the 19th century, created a they've got a whole bunch of tech, and they've got their own special places where they live and no one knows about them, and they're super secret, and they kind of, the rest of society is built to kind of farm as a farm for them, so the reality that you and me think is there is basically just a kind of a factory for the guys who actually run the show with their airships. The airship was like the model of technology that they had during the mid 19th century. It's such a great story. Look up the Sonora Air Club stuff. It's brilliant. Donald Trump, is like the kind of the mantle holder of this breakaway civilization. He may not even be aware of this, but maybe he is, thanks to his uncle who was well into Tesla. Trump is maybe their like front man. Maybe Trump is like the guy who's going to bring some of their technology on stream. I mean, seriously. Whether you think they're a goodie or a baddie, Trump's their main man. Not looking great, is it? But yeah, like airships and UFO law and conspiracy law are bigger now than they were during the publication of The Invisibles at any time. And I'm not saying that it springs from here, but I'm saying that the fact that they're here and that they do appear to be fulfilling this kind of like alter alien ascended kind of role is interesting. Over the page. Now, they're still having a bit of a mooch. They're still tripping. They are on the South Bank looking. You can see they're looking across at Big Ben and Westminster again here. They are on the South Bank having a bit of a look around, having a bit of a chat in the way that Tom and Dane do. Tom helps us out here by saying what we knew. Dane asks, now where are we going? He says, Tom replies, nowhere in particular. The Paris situationists used to call this sort of thing a dérivé, drifting aimlessly through the city, making it new and strange. The street of little girls, Sun Street, the ocean bar, and the square of the appalling mobile or mobile. These terms, the street of little girls, Sun Street, the ocean bar, the square of the appalling mobile, these all sound like words from Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, but which goes to show how much this situationist stuff had been inspiring him, and for how long a time. These words actually come from the Formulaire pour un urbanisme nouveau, the formulation of a new urbanism, which a French writer called Ivan Cheglov wrote in 1953 at the age of just 19. He was only 19 when he wrote this stuff, which is this kind of wonderful visionary piece about how about just like the creation of like a dream city, and I'd mean dream in the sense of like the best, but also in one that kind of answers the desires of your dreams, and how that's the thing that's missing from current conceptions of urbanism, and how the situationists, who Chekhov was a member of and kind of certainly an inspiration for, like fed into, right? This is the kind of ideas they were about. The formulation of a new urbanism essay contains a very famous line: "The hacienda must be built," which is this kind of like call to arms for the creation of this utopian space, this better thing, this kind of hedonistic, bohemian, but kind of dream desire fulfilling space that the modern urban subject can live in. Yeah, so like the Hacienda in Manchester, going back to the rave thing that we saw in the funny poster at the start of the issue, yeah, which isn't part of the issue, that's just an advert for Vertigo. But this understanding of rave consciousness and the Hacienda being like the kind of the first indoor temple of rave culture in Manchester, set up by Tony Wilson and Co. Factory Records in the mid-80s, but kind of coming into its own by sort of 88, 89. This is very much in the air and very much a key thing, and that their decision to create the Hacienda was driven by these ideas of the situationists as well. The square of the appalling mobile is like this idea, refers to this idea that you would have like a bad quarter in your city. You would have an area where all of the terrible aspects of urban living and the appalling mobile, which basically means like either kind of like bad public art or bad cars, like maybe the same thing. You would have a square that you'd have a quarter of the city that is devoted to that, so that people could go there and learn to kind of enjoy it rather than be oppressed by it. Like all of the negative aspects of urban living, all of the pollution, all of the threat, all of the noise and dust can all be kind of kept in a special place where you can learn to kind of spectacularize it, if you like. There's a palace in your head, boy. Learn to live in it always. This is something that Tom will come back to, and I think we'll get there probably a bit better in a later issue, in a couple of issues' time. But this is the thing about, and kind of refers to the Blakean and Huxleyan notion that one's apprehension of the world is not necessarily a matter of choice, but a matter of perception, of being able to see the what do I mean? The transcendent qualities, like the positivity, like the thing you want to be able to see in the world, and this is kind of the corrective of the social and material losses that a homeless person like Tom is subject to. Yeah, you can make up for that, and by doing so, one has a greater kind of power and freedom by choosing the frame with which one looks at the world and the way that one sees things. Being able to control one's perspective at will, to see the not necessarily the most positive thing, but the most necessary thing, the thing you need to see, the best thing, is something that the magician or the invisible, as we've got them here, can learn to do. There's a palace in your head, boy. Learn to live in it always. You can always have that access to that better space if you kind of know how to go inside and find it. And then once going inside, kind of project it outside. I think that's maybe the more difficult bit. There's no going back. We've unpicked the thread of the world. Look there. Urizen, deadly black, in chains unbound. So here we've got, talking of bearded stones, yeah? We've got a statue of Urizen from Blake's Book of Urizen. Urizen? Urizen is like he's like the kind of the mad Yahweh of William Blake's personal system. His kind of like his kind of homemade religion that he had, based upon kind of the angelic teachings, angels again, of Emanuel Swedenborg, who was like I'm going to say Swedish because his name is Swedenborg, but it's probably not Swedish. He was a guy who kind of had a very kind of popular kind of cult of spiritual contact, but he called it angelic contact. And, you know, like a precursor to the Theosophical movement and to kind of like the Western, like soft occult or esoteric tradition in general. Who Blake was a follower of, and whose thought, Blake was well into it. Blake was well into contacting these angels to get his ideas for his poetry from. So the Book of Urizen, where this line, Urizen, deadly black, in chains unbound. Urizen. So what? So does it mean your reason? we know about Blake's kind of system that he kind of has poetic genius as a kind of as the ideal of freedom, put in as a binary against reason, measure, rationality, oppression. Yeah, like your reason is kind of like the bad, mad god, if you like. And his name Urizen means your reason, as in like the way that you measure and rationality is these traditional enemies of poetry, genius, an inspiration of freedom, as we might think about it, of the kind of liberation that invisibilism offers. It also means, in my view, I don't know how to me it sounds like it might be saying you rising, you reason, you rising. Which is kind of about the bourgeois morality that Blake was beginning to see develop literally on his front doorstep in the city of London as it became an abstracted international thing, as kind of global trade actually kind of really got going during his lifetime. And that's about getting ahead, social advancement, kind of like the creation of wealth pockets for the individual self rather than for the kind of the glory of nature's God, if you like, that kind of Blake would have been more into. There's so much going on in here, really. So what we've got here, this is like, it's really cool. So they're looking from the South Bank across at Parliament, and in the middle we have a statue of Urizen. So this kind of like magic London that they've somehow gone to, and it's probably just a matter of perspective, but also it feels a bit more real than that. It's populated by people. This woman here, who's is this kind of like beautiful like boho chick with like alien telepathy head, if this was Star Trek. And like London was full of people who looked like this, as far as I remember, back in 1990, in the mid 1990s. She also obviously looks a lot like King Mob, who dumped Dane here, like a kind of a female version of him, but with an even more elongated alien telepathy head. So this trip land that they've gone to is a bit more than just an imaginary thing. It's got people who smoke and stuff in there, and you could trip and walk around this part of London back then, and probably now, and see people as kind of as delightfully brilliant as this young lady is here. And it's probably worth a try if you've got the constitution for it. But anyway, sorry, yeah. But yeah, they're like the feather boa. Like you just used to see them all the time. Do you still see feather boas around? I hope you do. So we've got there's a statue of Urizen in the Thames, and it's a kind of obviously a landmark in this imaginary London, or this kind of alternative London, or this kind of like across the dimensional barrier London. That's kind of cool. We know that it's kind of a backwards TikTok over the rainbow place by virtue of the fact that Dane says that the face on Big Ben is now reversed. But what kind of a place, right? What kind of a place would have a statue of Urizen in the Thames, right? That's kind of weird, right? Because like a statue has its kind of its civic meaning, which is like this is a thing we're proud of. As you go back to the statues that we saw of Schmutz and Churchill earlier, right? This is a statue of Urizen, deadly black in chains unbound. Now this comes from a point in the Book of Horizon where Los, who was kind of like Blake's figure for the divine imagination, this moment is where he first kind of experiences, or where like the universe experiences sort of existential doubt for the first time, and Los has this kind of like contact experience with Urizen, kind of recognizes his presence almost for the first time, and it's Horizon in chains. Obviously, chaining, quantifying and binding things is an Horizon-oid thing to do. So Horizon in chains is Horizon squared, right? It's like it's Horizon doing Horizon's thing. So he likes being chained in some, a god in chains. You kind of think, oh, why is he in chains? That doesn't sound good. But maybe the chainedness is like an important part of his nature and an important part of his power. And what kind of a society has a statue of that? This kind of like terrible kind of male, like bad solar phallus kind of energy totem thing, embedded in the Thames, where the Isis River, where the tide ebbs and flows twice in 24 hours. Is that a symbol of the kind of the groovy bohemian female quality surrounding him and keeping him safely away from us? Or is this a means of kind of like celebrating him? Is this containment or celebration? Obviously, containing Urizen is something that he likes, and he's obviously on this boundary. It's just near Westminster, between Westminster and the Tower of London. So kind of like binding the city within his view almost. It's an interesting think about why this statue of Urizen is here, other than the obvious kind of cool, easy interpretation, which is that this is the land where William Blake went in his visions. What a wonderful stroll to be having around London, literally to be taking a stroll in his poetic imagination. And comics, ladies and gentlemen, this is really cool shit, right? We get this bit here where everything that ever happened to you is real, even your dreams, them most of all. You don't think this world is any less real than the one you left, do you? There are many worlds, many cities, and all of them are just shockwaves spreading out from one single moment of clarity and understanding. Tom going a bit Buddhist there at the end. But he flings something into the river when he's talking about ripples. And it creates some ripples. He flings kind of an offering to the statue of Urizen, if you like. Now, the normal thing there's two options here, I think. We think it's Tom throwing it in because he would know that to leave an offering for the god of Urizen would be the decent thing to do, and maybe by offering him an offering, you're not necessarily empowering you're just buying him his favor, getting him to leave you alone a little bit. So normally we would throw in a coin. That would be the traditional offering to leave in a body of water like this. And if you remember, a coin is like a symbolic head, yeah, because it's always got the Queen's head on it. Remember how we were told that the Queen's head is on all the money earlier. There's a kind of a material, temporal power bound up in that, but also like a sacrificial, sacral power, like a religious thing. We used to sacrifice people's heads by bunging them in the River Thames, right? Now it's kind of it's a bit more sanitized, and all of that sacrificial energy is tied up in the symbol, the talismanic form of the coin. So I think Tom is lobbing a coin in as an offering to Urizen here. Could be a button. Could be the button that the aliens flicked off one of their clothes. Like a button obviously signifies a fastening, and also a fastening of clothes, of one's wear, of one's cloaking and clothing, the way that one's kind of like protects and displays oneself to the material world. So maybe it's that. However, following the art, that button is more just like a thing for that bit. There wasn't really a button in mind when that happened, I don't think. But yeah, like Tom tosses in something and it creates a ripple, and that's used to describe this kind of moment of like Buddhist transcendence, from which where awareness kind of like stops and starts instantly, and where one there then pieces together one's awareness of the enfolded physical universe from. That's page 20. All of that was page 20. We're deep into Blakean dream territory here. But then there's also this bit here. The next bit in the comic is this lovely tribute. All you could say about kind of tribute to Neil Posner, 1955 to 94, who was a guy who was like an editor at DC who died of AIDS. Like just before this issue came out, basically, and this is a nice in memoriam to him. Or you can say what you like about Vertigo's kind of like liberal values, stuff like this was really important, and they've got all this like AIDS awareness helpline stuff at the bottom. It's a really good thing for them to have put in their comic. There's some interest here insofar as there's a picture by Howard Porter, who would be working with Grant Morrison on the Justice League comic, kind of concurrently with the publication of The Invisibles. Like, that was his other kind of go-to artist at the time for a good 30 or 40 issues they did there. But also this lovely portrait here, this kind of triptych of the late Neil Posner, is drawn by Phil Jimenez, who is an artist, a gay artist, I think, who we will get to know a lot better as we go along. But here's a nice little, like, nobody would have known that Phil Jimenez would go on to be the main artist for The Invisibles. But here's a little kind of spooky, sneaky preview of the kind of fine line work and handsome men that you can get from him. So yeah, R.I.P. Neil Posner. Rest ye well. So we're over the page, onto page 21 in the comic. They're still tripping. These guys are still going, man. And they get to Canary Wharf. That's that there. That's 1 Canada Square. That's like, everyone's called it Canary Wharf, but it's 1 Canada Square, like the main building with this big pyramid on top of it. You could well see that from my flat window when I was at university. It was well cool. Now, did you never wonder why they put a pyramid on top of Canary Wharf there? It was built as a power accumulator. It stands on the major southern dragon line, which goes right through Buckingham Palace. This is Tom again, explaining the kind of the totemic geography of London. Yeah, kind of that is what it says, really. It's like, if there's ley lines, and there are, obelisks with pyramids on the top of them, like 1 Canada Square, are obviously involved, right? Whether, I think it's an interesting point to note that, like, we somehow think that ley lines kind of exist without human interference, whereas they don't. They're not like, they may be kind of like natural things, but humans are natural things too, and part of our industry and the way we create and totemic objects which can realign them is part of nature's plan too, right? Even if that nature is maybe kind of like not terribly kind to the other humans or the other gods. But yeah, dragon line. That's like the old Chinese word for ley line. The Chinese kind of traditional Chinese medicine kind of has a very kind of comprehensive theory for this kind of thing. We call them ley lines, they're not dragon lines. That was Alfred Watkins' work back in the 1920s, I guess. But this kind of idea that Canary Wharf has is like the omphalos of like the global financial system and of the kind of is the power hub of the New World Order. Remember, we're the New World Order from earlier in the issue. That comes from the work of the London Psychogeographical Society, which was kind of started in the 60s by a guy called Fabian Thompson, but was very kind of hip and popular in the 90s due to the efforts of a writer called Stuart Home, who wrote like millions of pamphlets and novels in a kind of a Defoe-esque kind of like one-man literature factory vibe thing. And was very trendy at the time, very hip. His work is a bit too bizarre and confrontational to have ever kind of made it into kind of like mainstream success. But you can see like the polite version of what he does in the likes of Ian Sinclair, and then obviously you can see like the polite version of Ian Sinclair in Peter Ackroyd. And I'm not saying that like Home is the wellspring for Sinclair, but and I'm not also saying that Stuart Home never got reviewed in The Guardian, because he did, but Stuart Home was like this very popular kind of like underground London psychogeography magic guy at the time, and kind of like rebel writer, like a kind of a transgressive literature guy. And this whole thing about Canary Wharf being on the ley line is directly from him, and it's a nice little kind of reminder of his ideas and what was in the air at the time. Dane calls Tom a sad old fucker because Tom is just kind of going on about all this stuff. We see kind of for the first time really since they've emerged from the underground that Dane's got a little scar on his head now, or at least a cut on his a mark on his head. Dane calls Tom a sad old fucker, and he goes, "That's me, I'm a sad old fucker." And he turns and he says, "Look at the stars, boy." And Dane's like, "No, you can't see the stars in London because it's too bright. Light pollution, terrible problem. The stars are our birthright, guys. Not being able to see them does terrible things to the soul. Of this, I am convinced." So Tom, because he's like a badass magician, turns off all the lights in London. Boom. And suddenly you get this like wonderful display by the Milky Way. "Last night I heard the dog star bark. Mars met Venus in the dark." That's another line from one of the Tom O'Bedlam poems. And the dog star that he's referring to is Sirius, which, depending where you start these things, kind of leads the procession of the zodiac through the night sky, depending what time of year and obviously whereabouts in the world you are. But Sirius is the initiator star. Sirius is the star you look for at dawn, at the depth of night when you're experiencing your dark night of the soul and you've gone further than and you can't maybe go any further. Sirius is the star that the gnosis pours through. Okay, this is Illuminati shit, basically. And Tom is allowing Dane to see that. Obviously, he's also doing a trick of just like pure badass magic to stop Dane from writing off this sad old fucker. He gives him this amazing thing, which Dane this amazing light show caused by turning off the lights by that inversion, which Dane, of course, says, oh, this is just a coincidence. So Tom clicks his fingers, click, and all of the lights in the city come on at once. And Tom just says he agrees, or does he? Coincidence. Did you really do that? You've got to show us how to do that. Do you still want to be invisible then? Is that really what you want? Invisible, yeah, I suppose so. Then it's a deal. So, he's seen the Sirius star, or the stars. He's reached the black peak of his trip. He says he's given a chance to choose by his own free will whether he wants to continue on his initiation and go onward into this society of invisibilism that he is being inducted into, and he freely consents. Still not sure how old Dane is. He's probably only about 17. So whether it's informed adult consent, I don't really know. But anyway, he said, yeah, I'm okay. I'm up for it. I want to be in the Invisibles. And Thomas said, okay, you're in. This is like that point of the initiation. Then it's a deal. Child was still 5-0 and fum. I smell the blood of a British man. I think we know that the British man whose blood can be smelled is probably Dane here. These kind of initiations never come without risk. They never come without blood often as well. What we've got here, though, that's another Tom of Bedlam line from Lear this time. Not the first one from Lear, but I suspect the inspiration from that comes via Alan Garner's book Elidor. Alan Garner is the guy that Grant Morrison always says in interviews is his favourite writer. He writes these kind of like beautiful, kind of like mystic, folksy, young adult-y kids books. They're not really kids books. They're the kind of kids books, and I don't mean in like a Harry Potter way. Like they're actually not really kids books. Alan Garner, he writes these wonderful kind of like earth magic stuff, which I recommend wholeheartedly. He's a great writer. And this line, Child Roland line is like the frontispiece for Garner's novel Elidor. The Child Roland is a well-known kind of fairy tale based on an old Scottish ballad, the Scottish connection with Morrison, Obbs, about like a guy who falls into Elfland, who goes underground, who kind of goes through an initiatory process like Dane has just been going through, and manages to kind of get a secret, is allowed to go free and given wisdom by the king of Elfland through virtue of his, he's the third son who tries to go and rescue a child. Roland goes to rescue a child. His two older brothers have tried and have never been seen again. But Roland goes, with the faith of his fathers and with, and his father's sword, his father's symbolic kind of wisdom and intellect, and comes back. And comes back a better changed man. While fighting this elf giant, Fee-Fi-Fo and Fum, that's obviously from Jack of the Beanstalk. These are right kind of old magic words that the elves and the giants would use. And here's Tom using them back at them. Or here's Tom saying, I'm that guy. Interesting. So we've got another advert here for Sandman Mystery Theatre. This was like the kind of the grown-up take on the word Sandman was so popular at the time. DC had another Sandman that they wanted to make into a successful comic, and they did. Interesting that we've got another bridge, we've got another dark river. Interesting that we've got another kind of three-eyed alien thing here, although it's a dude with a gas mask. But, dudes with gas masks do look a bit like aliens. Obviously, there's the Blitz connection too. That's Wesley Dodds, the Sandman, the master of dreams and the underworld. This is obviously because this is what Vertigo comics are about. They're about this kind of like urban fantasy. But it's funny how the Invisibles seems to kind of take and give a unique spin on a lot of metaphors and motifs and trends, vibes that were really current, which were definitely in the air. The Invisibles condenses them into its own wonderful thing. What else? I wanted to say something. Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, what was his name? Gilles Levin was his French name, but the Russian name, his actual name, was Cheglov. That's right. Who wrote the situationist stuff about the square of the appalling mobile. He was locked up for 5 years in the sanitarium for trying to dynamite trying to blow up the Eiffel Tower because the lights on it went in through the window of his flat and kept him awake at night. He was a legend, basically, and a dynamiter. And that's going to be important when we come back to later issues of The Invisibles too. Sorry, I wanted to get that in because I didn't want to have to go back. Sorry. I've broken the thread. You've broken the thread, Bobsy. Sorry, mate. So that bit about Fee Fi Fo Fum takes us up to the end of page 22. Over the page, we've got our advert for Sandman Mystery Theatre by, Steven Seagal and Matt Wagner, would it be? Yeah, Steven Seagal, not Steven Seagal, but if only, right? If only. And Matt Wagner. I've never read the Sandman Mystery Theatre, but the fact that Matt Wagner's involved leads me to think it's probably all right. Write in if you've got opinions about it. Tell me where to start. At the beginning, Bobsy. Shut up. Okay, and we're on to page 23. 23. Here we go. After having heard the magic words of the giant and after having made the agreement, after having actually said, yeah, I'm going to continue on my initiatory path that Dane has just done, the trip's over. And he wakes up the next morning not quite being able to believe what he's just been through. So here's St. Paul's Cathedral. You can tell by its orientation there that he is a little bit south and a little bit east of St. Paul's Cathedral. I don't know why I reckon this. I reckon he's still north of the river. Is he really that? Yeah, he is. Yeah, I reckon he's still north of the river, right? And I think that he is probably in an alleyway off of Lambeth Hill. That's just about, a couple of streets away from St. Paul's in about this direction. I'm going to choose Lambeth Hill because even though it's not in Lambeth, it is called Lambeth Hill, and that gives us the nice connection to William Blake. William Blake was like he was born and raised in Soho, but produced his best work while living in Lambeth, where he lived for a long time. Lambeth Hill is named not because it's in Lambeth, it's on the north side of the river, kind of just on the southern edge of the city of London. But you could have seen, I guess, back in the old days, it's a bit of a raised bit of ground, a hill, not like a huge hill, but a hill, and you could have seen Lambeth from there, right? So that's why it's called Lambeth Hill, even though it's not in Lambeth. So that's why we've got the name of, that's why we're choosing that as our spot for Dane to have rested his head and woken up in tonight. Also, Lambeth Hill is mentioned in Peeps because there's a pub there called the Green Dragon. We've just been talking about the Dragon Line of London. And I'm also going to say that that's where he is because there's St. Mary's Somerset, which used to be called St. Mary Magdalene, the Sacred Feminine, blah, blah, blah. There's a tower, an old church tower there, which is now a garden. The rest of the church was demolished in 1871, but the tower still stands, and in it was a rebuilt parish church in 1668. After the fire of 1666, it's got its charter for rebuilding in 68, I think. And we think it may be a Hawksmoor. It's a wren, but it looks like some of the obelisks on there look like they may have been Hawksmoor as well. So that takes us right into Hawksmoor. It takes us into From Hell. It takes us into the Alan Moore, Grant Morrison thing, which maybe we'll talk about another day. Maybe not. This probably isn't the place for it. Dane wakes up, scratches his head. Oh, I had a big night. Woken up in Lambeth Hill, apparently. Tom, I can't find Tom. Is that you? Da da da. Turn the page, and we got the hunters again. Uh-oh, they've not only got Tom here with his Obi-Wan jacket, but they found Dane. Now, the eagle-eyed viewer will be rewarded here. If you look at this one, and in fact, if you look at all of them, you can probably work out what's going on, although I won't actually say it. Well, we'll do that next issue. And that's the end of the issue, is that, oh my God, the scary hunters from before have found Dane. They're coming for him. It's a bad scene, guys. Very scary. Great cliffhanger. So after having had this initiation, after having been warned of the giant, after I've been having this wonderful trip in this like really cool place, Dane wakes up, and next thing you know, like the toffs from hell want his blood, and that's not a great thing. The connection there is so this is another urban legend really about like the rich hunting the poor for sport. Now, the rich harvest the lives of the rich harvest the lives of the poor. They murder them. We call it austerity at the moment in Britain. But it's a form of social murder, and it's not me saying that. That's the UN says that. The UN, who are the New World Order, but sometimes they say stuff you agree with, guys. Let's be honest. When you've got a New World Order versus like the old world Tories, then let's go with New Wave each time, guys. Pardon me. More politics, more digressions. It's always a surprise to me how few attestations in the historical record of rich people hunting in this kind of very like it's a hunt kind of thing, like as a formalized or ritualized game or sport. How few times there appears to have been rich people hunting poor people for fun. Something about the cynic in me makes me think that that's something that humans would do an awful lot. And although they kind of do in this way that's kind of like been kind of socially kind of engineered, they kind of don't in the way that's just like, yeah, let's just go out and like hunt a bunch of poor people down. Although rumours persist, and as well they might, and the rumours don't have to persist because there is a reality here, actual sport chasing down poor people, there's a lot of films about it, but there doesn't appear to be many actual historical accounts of it, not accounts, but like records of it happening. On the one hand, why would there be? It's not the kind of thing you're going to advertise. On the other hand, it has happened. And the main kind of like historical example that we have of this from the 20th century is the White Terror, which happened kind of during and immediately after the Spanish Civil War, where our totem spirit, George Orwell, of this issue, went to fight. And that's what brings Orwell's ghost back into view, and that's what ties this little bit about the Invisibles, issuesode number 2, up nicely. Yeah, great Orwell's ghost, Batman. I think earlier on I said that this issue is the October issue, which means that it was published in October, and that's what I said, I think, earlier, and I think I got that wrong, because obviously the October issue would have been published a couple of months before, so this probably actually hit the public. People could have read this issue from August 1994, or thereabouts. I mention that because do you remember that column? Grant Morrison's got another column here, another invisible ink, waiting for the letters to arrive. He's had to kind of write another one of his loaded magazine travelogues, one of his kind of like sub-gonzo things. It's very Orientalist, this one, guys, but it was written in May 1994, so about 3 months before this thing hit the newsstands. He says during his account here that one of the reasons, he's off in India getting enlightened, and he's writing the Invisibles while he's doing this. It sounds like the life of writing. It does sound brilliant, to be honest, what he's up to. But the kind of the objectification of this other culture is a bit cringy now. And it's nice that in the 20 years since, we've the communication channels between Western and Indian culture have opened up a bit, so that these kind of travel reports aren't really necessary anymore. That it's quite possible to just check out Indian newspapers or look at films of the Indian people are making online very easily, and that's a good thing. However, this particular Invisible Ink column does need to be mentioned, because I love the fact that there's, I don't know if you can see it, but he starts to talk about, Grant Morrison gets abducted by aliens while he's writing this Invisible Ink column, basically, and kind of about where it happens, there's this wonderful bit of like, I think you can see it there, just here, there's this wonderful bit of like bitch type of like the printing has kind of gone wrong, and it is, and one line of text has been printed either printed over itself a bit off, or like another line of text has been printed over it, and it's got this wonderful kind of like dimensions breaking down feel to it, which is great, because while he was writing this column, if you believe him, and I see no reason not to, Grant Morrison had an intense visionary experience. We've just been reading about them. We've just been reading about abduction experiences. Grant Morrison's alien abduction, which he writes about frequently. Look it up online, right? If you don't know about it already, then look up Grant Morrison abduction Kathmandu or something like that, and there'll be a load of stuff about it. literally between finishing one sentence in this column and starting the next one, he gets abducted by aliens. He's sitting on the roof of a hotel in Kathmandu. He's just done some hash, but not enough. Hash doesn't give these kind of visions, apparently. Not apparently, it doesn't. But the kind of vision that he apparently reportedly had. And he's on it, mate. Like, everything changes here. And the abduction experience that we've just seen Dane go through suddenly takes on this interesting, remarkable transposition with real life. It happened, right? It happened to the author of this book. Not in the precise circumstances that are described, but this kind of like hyper-real visionary experience, this kind of thing which religions are based on historically, but we don't really allow thoughts like that to get in anymore, happens to Grant Morrison. And that will... It gives this, such a silly thing to think about, but it's realist, it's realism, right? Like, it's autobiography. This happened, this meeting aliens and elves and angels thing, it happened. Okay, we're not reading this comic because it's escapism. We're reading it because it tells us something about real life, the way it's experienced by people, and that fact is really, really important. And for all you can say about the kind of the slightly sort of tacky way this column is written, it remains a really important historical document, if you like, but also a really important piece of the puzzle that is the Invisibles that we will be coming back to again and again and again. And that's it. That's the end of this one. We've got a Moon Shadow advert, Barbalith. We've got a Dream King, a Dream Squeezer advert as well. Lovely bit of Mark Hempel art there. So that's not insignificant. We've got another listing of all of the Vertigo comics that are out this month. We've got another column here. It's not written by Grant Morrison this time, like the one was last issue. It's written by Steven Seagal, who, he's an ass-kicking action hero, who's writing Sandman Mystery Theatre. We just saw that advert. Remember this one with the... lost it. This Steven Seagal, yeah. He's written the On the Ledge column. It's not terribly relevant to what we're talking about. So that's it, right? That's the end of... okay. And then Jonah Hex, Wild West Cowboy, Confederate Flag, Dodgy, What's All the Shooting About? And then Baseball. It's like rounders for big guys. Baseball cards advert, which comics used to be all about, and I don't see these things anymore, which is a shame. But yeah, I'm sure you still have baseball cards, right? Like we used to. This was a lovely little Toronto Blue Jays. Oh, this isn't even American. This is Canadian. Oh, you learn something new every day. And that's So I just feel like, for completeness' sake, I should go through every page in the comic. That was the Invisible Podcast, issuesode 2. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was a bit more coherent than last time. I think it's even longer, maybe, judging by the look of this. But I hope you're bearing with. Thanks ever so much for Patreoning us and following this. Maybe you're not Patreoning us and you're seeing this a few months down the line, where I've put it up for free on the internet, I think it's called. Welcome. Thanks ever so much. If you want to get these issuesodes before everybody else, go on Patreon and get them monthly as they come out. Maybe even more than monthly. Depends how much money you get of me, isn't it? Right? Thanks for your patronage and support, but more importantly, thanks for just watching and listening to me rattle on about this ancient old comic, which I'm beginning to rediscover I love very much. I love you too. And, follow me on at Bobsy Mindless. Check out at Shadow Trap HQ. Check out the Shadow Trap on Instagram. Check out Diane, libsyn.com. Diane, I don't know. Check out Diane and the Shadow Trap. And I'll see you very soon, okay? Thanks for watching. Bye.